Hello there and welcome back to another video here on Wristwatch Revival. My name is Marshall. Thank you so much for coming along. This time on the bench, we have this beautiful little ladies Hamilton watch from probably the late 30s or early 40s from the design and from what I can tell from how it looks from the outside. It's got this lovely inscription on the back to Elsie from Bill. And this one belongs to kind of a grandma of mine. I don't have any grandmas left, as it turns out. And so sometimes you scoop up a couple of them that are still around. And the owner of this watch is exactly that person to me. She's a lovely woman. And this belonged to a relative of hers. Here's what the watch looks like next to a regular watch, by the way. This is just one of my watches. And as you can see, it is tiny when you sit next to it. I mean, it doesn't even fill up the dial of my watch here. So yeah, this thing's really small. And of course that means the movement's going to be even smaller inside, but that's kind of part of the challenge. And she asked me if I could take a look at it because again, this watch is a family heirloom and it belonged to relatives of hers and it won't run. And that's where you and I come in. So what we're going to do is we're going to restore this watch. And, this is one of the things I absolutely love about this hobby is that this is a little piece of history for the owner. This is a piece of family history and these things are important and they're worth keeping around and they're worth restoring. And so that's what we're going to do today. So in order to do that, we need to take the whole thing apart. We need to clean it. We need to inspect it to make sure that there's no issues with it. Then we need to put it back together, lubricate it, get it running right, and make sure it looks good on top of all that. Now, for a project like this, my stance on it, and since this is a hobby of mine, I get to kind of pick and choose how I want to approach these things. My stance is that I'd like to try to keep this watch as original as possible. This isn't likely a watch that she's going to be wearing around very much. Oh, check this out. Nice, it's 14 karat gold. The case on this, it's a white gold case. So wow, Bill spent some money on this thing. That's really nice. I didn't expect that actually. I just thought it would be a stainless steel case and I didn't notice it when I took it apart either until reading the inside of the case. So that's pretty awesome. The movement is brass. These are usually plated in rhodium. Oh, interesting. Oh, okay. Okay, never mind. So it does look like it wants to run. I thought it was running for a minute, but then it stopped. And that is an indicator. Oh yeah, do you see this kind of corrosion there on that middle center wheel jewel? That's another indicator. These are all indicators that this watch desperately needs a service, meaning that cleaning process that we're going to put it through. So hopefully that will solve the problems. The fact that it does run a little bit is a good sign. What I was saying before though, is that, there's kind of a sliding scale based on every single watch is its own use case in my mind. So on one end of it is a watch that you're going to wear every single day and it's meant to run well and keep good time. And that's kind of its purpose. And in that case, originality of parts doesn't take the priority. I would replace mainsprings. I would replace any worn parts. I would replace anything, that I thought would improve the performance of the watch. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you tend to have watches like this. This is more of a family heirloom piece. Pocket watches often fall into this category, especially old ones, because very few people actually carry a real pocket watch with them these days. It's more something to have around to take out of the drawer every once in a while, that kind of thing. And that's where this falls as well. Does it want to run? Yeah, actually, oh, I spoke too soon. Okay. So something is stopping it after some period of time. And again, that can either be the fact that it needs to be cleaned, right? What happens is the lubricants that we use on these watches, when they kind of dry out over time, will eventually turn into the opposite of a lubricant. They turn into kind of a paste and they will slow down and even stop the movement if it gets gunked up. As you can see here, we need to remove the dial from the movement before we can start taking apart the thing properly. But yeah, so, this watch, I am going to intend to try to keep it as original as possible, but also under the condition that it's running, right? And running decently. I don't need this thing to be a super high performer, but I do need it to run well before I feel okay about handing it back. Okay, now we can get into the meat and potatoes of the situation here. I'm going to use my cannon pinion removal tool to remove the cannon pinion. It's friction fit. And anytime you hear me or any watch person say friction fit, it just means that it's pushed onto place. It's not held on by a screw, it's not held on by a spring, and it's not held on by any type of adhesive or anything like that. And in this case, that cannon pinion that I took off is friction fit onto the center wheel. And I'd like to be able to remove that when the time comes on this side. That's why I start by just removing the cannon pinion first. Let's take a look at the balance here. Ooh, okay, it comes off okay. Sometimes those old balance springs can get a little bit concerning, let's say. And that one did actually look a little bit like that, but hopefully we'll still be able to get this thing to run well. I'm going to go ahead and take off the pallet fork bridge and the pallet fork. As you can see, the design of this movement is similar to watches that I've worked on, though it isn't the same shape. Oh, interesting. So I took out the pallet fork and it looks like, so I actually thought that this thing didn't have any power in it because it kept stopping. But it turns out it did actually have a little bit of power. So normally I would have let down the mainspring to allow that power to be released under my control. But in this case, the movement just sort of unwinds itself and we call it good there. Not the end of the world. Yeah, like I was saying, this movement, as you can see, it's a different shape. And, you know, the vast majority of movements that I work on are a circle. But this one is more of an oval or egg-shaped pattern. But the parts are still the same. The cool part is that as long as the engineers and designers who design these movements, were able to make it work, you can kind of put these things in different orders in different places and use little tricks here and there to stack them up on top of each other so that you can achieve such a small size like this. It's a really impressive feat, not only just from a design perspective that you could make a watch that's reliable and actually works well at this size, but also from a manufacturing perspective that, you know, this watch was made, again, I'm guessing, I don't know the exact year of it, but I would say sometime between, I don't know, 1935 and 1943, somewhere in that era. And you know, I mean, look, we were pretty far along manufacturing wise by then, but some of these parts that they were able to make in mass production back then, they're tiny. And it's really impressive that they're able to put those out and the numbers that you need to do at the quality level that you need to do to be a mass producer. This watch and movement was made by Hamilton. That's a Hamilton watch company, which interestingly was actually started in the United States. It was founded in 1892 in the USA, and it had its full run as a U.S. watch company. They made pocket watches and then transitioned to wristwatches when those got popular. But they were a victim of the quartz crisis, if you've ever heard of that. The wristwatch industry went through a major restructuring, as we would say nowadays, in the late 60s, early 70s, when the quartz movement came out. That's the battery-powered movements that are in a lot of watches these days. And what happened is that the quartz movements were cheaper and kept better time. They were cheaper to make, cheaper to buy, and they kept better time than these mechanical watches did. And at the time, you know, people figured that watches were more or less purely a functional item, meaning that if you could make it more accurate for cheaper, it would just knock out the rest of the industry. And that's basically what happened. A bunch of the companies started folding, including Hamilton. They got purchased by actually a Swiss company, and they ended up moving to Switzerland. After a bunch of flip-flopping around, they actually still exist, and they've gotten bought by the Swatch Group, which is a very modern entity, which is a conglomerate of, in this case, mostly watch companies. Some of the biggest watch companies in the world, though, are under their umbrella. Omega, if you've heard of them, is there. Breguet, Tissot, Blancpain, Longines, and there's a bunch more, too, that are all under the Swatch Group. And Hamilton's one of those brands now as well. So in 1969, they went over to Switzerland, and then more recently, they became part of the Swatch Group. Kind of cool. A little bit of American/Swiss history with a piece like this. As you can see, things come apart pretty nicely here. Just because it's a little tiny movement doesn't mean it's really that much different from what I'm used to working on. It's a little tricky because I can't, I tried to take this setting lever, screw it. Okay, there it goes. Yeah, that's another surefire indicator, by the way, that this watch just needs a really good service. When parts get stuck like that shouldn't. Now we can take apart the mainspring barrel. Whoa. Jumpy. And I can take out the barrel arbor and the mainspring as well. This is a good example of what I was talking about before. The mainspring is an often replaced item, particularly a mainspring like this. This is an old type of mainspring. As you can see, it's blued carbon steel. It's also, the shape of it is just a circle, a concentric circle coming out like a spiral. And a modern mainspring doesn't actually look like that. It actually looks more like an S shape. But I'm going to actually try to keep that mainspring, even though another one might perform a little bit better. Again, I'm making the call here that originality is going to be better than a little bit more performance on a watch like this. I wouldn't have a problem doing it any other way, but like I said, you have to kind of draw the line somewhere. Okay, so everything goes into the baskets for the watch cleaning machine. But before we put it in, let's take a look at this weird kind of bracelet setup. This is clamped down on like a cloth string. And this was meant to be worn, well, I said bracelet, I kind of meant it. This was meant to be worn almost like a fashion bracelet that happened to have a watch on it, rather than, you know, the more traditional, like a leather strap or a metal bracelet that you'd see these days. So just for cleaning purposes, I'm just going to take the buckle off. I don't want to cut or try to mess around with this rope string situation. I could, but it looks like it's been kind of melted maybe back together or something, and I don't want to mess with that. So I'm just going to clean that all together and hope that it comes out nicely. Okay, now everything can go into the cleaning solutions and machines that we use. This one is a watch cleaning machine. So this one's made specifically for watch movement parts. And as you can see, the basket gets plunged into a cleaning fluid, and then my particular machine actually oscillates back and forth to clean the parts. And it does a really, really, really good job. Now, while those parts are getting cleaned, I didn't want to mention, I've got a Patreon for my YouTube channel here. Patreon is a place where you can go to support your favorite content creators, and you support them directly. So if you want to check out my page, it's patreon.com/wristwatchrevival. And yeah, I'd love for you to check it out. It's just, again, a way to support your favorite content creators. So if I happen to be one of them, that's the place to go. And I did want to say big thank you to each and every person who chooses to do so. It means the world to me, and it means that I get to keep making videos just like this. Now, the other machine that I'll use to clean is my ultrasonic cleaner. And this generally is used for bigger things like the case or, you know, the bracelets and stuff like that. But I'll say these are also very, very good at cleaning watch movement parts as well. It's just a little bit more involved because you have to kind of put them in different fluids that go into the water. So it's a little bit complicated, and it takes a lot longer than the watch cleaning machine. But, you know, it's actually a really great way to clean watch parts if you don't have a watch cleaning machine. In fact, we sell them at sutcliffehansen.com, where, you know, I've put together toolkits and stuff like that for you if you want to try out watchmaking as a hobby, which I highly recommend you do, by the way. And if you want to get into it, you can check that out. And we even have ultrasonic cleaners there that you can use to clean watch movements. Check out the completed cleaning process here. Beautiful little movement. They say it a lot, and it's often true, which is that they don't really make them like this anymore. And that's very much true in a scenario like this. I mean, this style of watch has been completely left behind. You know, this was a watch that they would call it a ladies' watch. And while that part of the industry still does technically exist, you know, there's a lot more just universal appreciation for watch designs rather than trying to separate everything out. And you know, this size of watch is almost unheard of this day, and no matter who made it or who it was made for. So this is a very different thing than you can get today. And I kind of appreciate that. You know, I kind of like that I can tell what era this watch was from just based on the size and the design of it. It's kind of interesting little historical thing. Okay, so we can wind in the mainspring again. As I mentioned before, I'm going to be reusing the mainspring on this, and I'm going to be reusing every part that I possibly can on this watch to keep it as original as possible. There we go. And now the good part. Look at this. There we go. And that's how you put the mainspring back in. That's a risk prevention scenario there, right? Because if you do that by hand, it is very easy to bend up the mainspring to get it super dirty or whatever, or to bend it. Look at this. Do you see this little tiny hole on the bottom of the barrel? And interestingly, there's also one on the lid. Further inspection needed. What is that about? Oh, it's right there. Do you see that little lifted part on the mainspring? That is actually meant to engage with that bottom hole and that top hole to keep the mainspring in place. Interesting. It looks like a little bit of overkill to me, just because this already had a hook end on it that would do the same job. But if I just slide it over, I should be able to line it up with the bottom and the top of the lid there to make sure that those parts are engaged. That's really interesting. I have not actually seen that before. Yeah, I just have to make sure that those parts line up properly. And yeah, you can see it kind of poking through there. And that looks good. All right, so the barrel's back together, and that means that we can grab the movement itself. Again, here's the setting lever screw. This is the one that was stuck. As I mentioned, like I'm using a grease here. It's kind of the heavier lubricant. And these type of things do have an interesting life cycle, particularly the ones that they used back in the day on these type of movements before we had this, which what I'm using here is a synthetic grease. And I'm just making sure, by the way, that that's going to spin freely. These synthetics hold up really well. And when they do break down, they break down pretty favorably, I would say. But the types of organic lubricants that they had used back when this watch was probably last serviced, and certainly when it was produced, now they were not like that. They were, there's some weird stuff that I found in the books that I've read from that era, say the 20s through the 40s or something like that. They would use all different types of stuff. I think it was a lot less uniform than it is now. The oils that I use, if you go to a, professional watchmaker bench, you're going to see many of the same stuff. These have become kind of the industry standard for many of the movements and types of movements that you work on. Okay, now we're going to get the train of wheels in, but as you can see, they're all kind of jam-packed on top of each other, so it's a little bit weird to figure out which one goes in where. I think I've got it sorted out now. This watch is about as simple as they get as far as functionality goes. It's called a time-only watch, meaning that it literally only shows hours and minutes. It doesn't even show a seconds hand. And there's certainly no date functionality or anything beyond that. Well, it does look like I've got the train of wheels in place, which means I can put on the barrel bridge. The barrel bridge is kind of interesting here because it has 2 jewels and then also the hole for the barrel itself. So there's 3 different things that I need to line up at once, which actually isn't too bad. 4 is where it starts to get kind of messy. And then as you can see, the train wheel bridge being so small only actually has 2 jewels on it. So I only need to line up those last 2 jewels, the 4th wheel and the escape wheel is what they're called. Now, before I go screwing anything down here, I'm going to try to get everything lined up properly. And I can already see that it's not. As you can see, when I move the center wheel, it won't move freely. But there, did you see how it kind of loosened up? And I can even push on the outside of the barrel and I can see the escape wheel spinning. Now, I'm a little nervous here just because I don't want that bridge to get bumped. So I'm going to make sure to screw down all of these now and make sure that everything's securely in place. The risk that you take here, of course, is that something shifts while you're working on the watch. And then all of a sudden you go to screw it down later and things aren't lined up and you start breaking parts. Okay, now I can put in the click spring. It kind of sits in a divot that's machined into the top of the barrel bridge. And then the click and the click screw can go in as well. I mentioned that these movements are made of brass. And you may be looking at it and going, well, wait a minute, that doesn't really look like brass. And you're right. The reason is that these are rhodium plated to give them that silver stainless steel kind of vibe. Okay, and with the click in place, I can put in the ratchet wheel. That's what the click actually clicks up against. As you can see, there's a square hole in the middle of the ratchet wheel, and that actually lines up with the top of the barrel arbor sitting inside of the mainspring barrel. And then this screw will hold those two things together, kind of like a sandwich. And I'll usually just kind of rest my finger on the edge of the mainspring barrel just to make sure that it's good and tight. But I will say that both that one and the crown wheel that I'm putting on now, these are screws that you want to be extra gentle with. Particularly this one, because as you'll see, it's actually reverse threaded. So you turn it the opposite way that you would think. So I'm doing lefty-loosey, but it's tightening it down. And what will often happen, especially for people who are newer to this, is that they will assume that that's a regular screw. They'll try to unscrew it, and guess what happens? They strip the whole screw out or they break the head off because they're actually tightening it down. And when it doesn't break loose, they go, well, I can, and then all of a sudden it's done. And you have to be really careful with both of those. Okay, flipping the movement over, we can put the cannon pinion back on. Remember how I talked about it being friction fit? Well, this is what I mean. Click, just like that. It just simply presses into place and it's just being held on by friction. Now, speaking of friction, this part right here, this is a clutch wheel. This one is under a significant amount of friction with another metal part called the sliding clutch. And when engaged, mainly when you're winding your watch for the purposes of, winding, not setting the time, these two parts will actually slide as a clutch up against each other. They have grooves in them so that they can only turn in one direction without letting it unwind in the other. But the cost you pay for that is friction. Whoop. The crown and stem there just jumped off. But I can just continue using that blue grease on there. Anyway, that friction is a bit of a downside. So blue grease, once again, it's called Mobius 9501. It is required here in this spot. There's other products you can use there as well if you are looking to get into the hobby. Like I said, there's almost always alternatives to different tools and lubricants that you can use that will, be effective enough for sure. There's a product called Molykote DX, which is suitable for those type of high friction things as well. And it's cheaper than Mobius 9501. Okay. So now that we've got the setting lever in place, just give it a quick test to make sure that it's moving back and forth properly. We can continue with the keyless works reassembly. This red oil that I'm using is Mobius HP 1300. Again, all of the ones that I'm using here are really good top of the line, basically synthetic oils. There's a substitute product that you can use also from Mobius. It's a non-synthetic. It's called D5 and it works very well. And it once again, it's a more economical alternative if that's what's holding you back from trying out the hobby. I mentioned it before, but I started that website with my friend Alex, really with the idea of trying to help people get into the hobby. I mentioned the toolkits. We've also got oiling kits with the oils that I use here on the channel, that kind of stuff. One of the hardest parts about doing this as a hobby is the beginning, because you just don't know what tools to get and you don't know what oils to get. And there's so many different options out there. You can get overwhelmed and, you don't want to spend your hard-earned dollars on something if you don't even know if it's the right one or if it's going to work well for you. And I had to go through that myself, where I've got a whole shoebox full of, it's kind of my tools graveyard of stuff that I either shouldn't have bought or that I bought that I thought would work for what I was doing. And it turns out it was made for clocks or really tiny watches or something different. And I just didn't have anybody to help me. So I just had to kind of do a bunch of trial and error with it. And now I feel like I have a good understanding of the tools and how it all works. But anyway, yeah, that was part of the reason to start the website. It's been really fun doing the site. I had a chance to go to like a show, it's called the Wind Up Watch Fair. It was in San Francisco. Me and Alex drove down there from Seattle, where we live. And I got to meet a bunch of viewers of the channel, and everybody was absolutely lovely. But it was interesting talking to people. People said that they like to fall asleep to my videos. At first, I didn't really know how to take that. It's like, are they that boring? But no, it was a compliment. In fact, they were saying that they relax them, and they kind of put them into a good mind state, and then they could actually sleep. So I thought that was it was kind of funny, but it was also a really nice thing. Okay. Keeping on with the restoration here. Now this is the pallet fork, and I'm just going to manually clean it, meaning I'm going to put it in one dip myself rather than through the watch cleaning machine. This is a probably unnecessary, but maybe necessary precaution that I like to do. The jewels that you see, the kind of the horns of that, in French, they call that an anchor. The tips of the anchor are held in by shellac, which is like an organic, you heat it up, it melts, and then it dries extremely hard. And it'll keep those in place, but it can, under some circumstances, soften when going through the watch cleaning machine and the different chemicals. So just as an absolute precaution, I'll like to just clean it myself. Okay, and once that's in place, I can put a little bit of a wind in the watch, and then I can also take the screw to hold down the pallet fork bridge, and I can tighten it down most of the way. This is a feel thing, right? This is where, you just sort of barely tighten it to friction, and then I can adjust the pallet fork to make sure that the pivots are in place. It can feel like they are. And there, did you see how that went down? That means that the pivot's in place. If I had fully tightened this before doing that, I risk snapping the pivot. And now you can see that it goes back and forth freely with just a tiny little touch. And now I can fully tighten down. It's really good to just be extra careful and sort of test that things look lined up and are operating properly before giving it that final little eighth of a turn of torque to make sure that it's down all the way. Okay, here we go. Moment of truth. We've got the balance wheel all set up, and now we get to find out if this thing's going to run and if it's going to keep running, because it was actually trying to kick up before, if you remember, but it would stop. Okay, it's running. Nice. It looks like it's going to keep running as well. When it stops like that, it usually comes down to one of two things. One of them I mentioned before, which is that the lubricants have dried up and it needs a service. But the other is that a tooth on one of the train wheels or on some rotating part will get around to that tooth and then stop. And then if you kind of force it by, it'll go around another circle again and then stop. And that isn't the case here. So that's great. Look at how well it looks like it's running too. And we haven't even lubricated this watch properly. So this is going to be, sweet. Now we can start by the lubrication process by using the thinnest oil we have here, which is Mobius 9010. And I'm going to use this on the train wheel pivots. And as you can see, it's actually a very, very small amount of oil that you want to use. There's a kind of a cup on the top of those jewels, and there can be a temptation to try to fill that up completely with oil. It kind of looks like that's what it was designed for, but it actually wasn't. You're meant to use a much smaller amount of oil than to fill up that entire little cup area on the top. I'm going to use the medium viscosity oil for the center wheel. It spins slowly and with a little more friction than the smaller wheels. And so I'll use that medium viscosity oil. Now, this is an old movement. As you can see, it doesn't have a shock protection system on it. So what that means is I need to let down the mainspring again, which is what I should have done when I first took apart the watch, remember? Well, I'll show you how to do it now. You move the click out of the way, and as you can see, once it's out of power, the balance will come to a halt. Now I can remove the balance. Okay, be careful. Please be careful when you do this, or Yeah, that's not what you want to see happen. It can just lead to some damage. Now that we have the balance out though, I can show you a part that I don't often get to show you, which is lubricating the pallets. So if you look at that front facing jewel there, I want to get a little bit of this very specialized grease right on the front of it, just like that. I know it doesn't look like much, but that's actually going to make a huge difference to the outright performance of the watch. And it's hard to get a good angle on it. So I'm happy to be able to show it to you there. Now with the balance though, without having the shock protection system, normally I can just remove the shock protection system on the top, remove the jewel setting, clean it and replace it. But here, since that doesn't exist, I actually need to disassemble the entire balance. So first the stud screw comes out. It is tiny. And as you can see, it leaves the balance wheel with the balance spring on it. Now, thankfully, I can just set that aside in a safe place because the part that we're going to be working on is actually the bridge here that goes over the top of it. But this has what have to be the smallest screws I've ever worked on. The fact that they could manufacture these screws to these tolerances at this time just absolutely blows my mind. That screw is freaking minuscule. It is like, I'm scared I'm just going to breathe too hard and it's going to go flying away on me. Seriously, they are that small. And these are holding together the jewel setting for this balance bridge. So now with both of those screws out, I can just take it apart and there's three pieces. There's the bridge itself, and then there's a cap jewel, and then there's this arm here that you use to regulate the watch later. But this is the part that needs to get cleaned, as it's the part that'll have the dried on oil on it. And it's the part that, oh yeah, you can actually see it. Do you see that spot in the middle? Yeah, that's what we need to clean. So once again, I'm going to use my One Dip. One Dip is just a brand name. It's a solvent. You know, it'll dissolve things like oil and dirt that are on top of these jewels. Now, it's not a miracle worker. That one had a lot of dried on oil on it. So I'm going to use some pegwood to manually clean the top after putting it into the One Dip, put it back in the One Dip, and now we should have a really nice, flat, clean surface. Take a look. Oh yeah, like a mirror. See, that's what you want to see to get the best performance out of a watch like this. Now I have to show you this screw. This is a nickel, okay, that I put on the microscope here. That's, if you've ever held a nickel, if you're not from the United States, a nickel is kind of our medium-sized coin. That's on the back of it in Monticello. That screw fits in the door. Like, it is unbelievable. And look at this detail. Do you see the bottom of it? It's polished. The bottom of that screw is polished because it actually points up on the balance bridge and you can see it point through. So they wanted to make it look good because that's the thing that you actually can see from that screw on the watch. My mind is just blown that they were able to produce, or even better yet, mass produce pieces that small that were actually reliably usable. It's incredible. Okay. Now I can put a droplet of oil right on the center of that cap jewel. This is very tricky work. There's a few different ways to do this. I would say this is my preferred method, though I do not like it. It's just the one that's worked the best for me, which is to try to align those the best I can and then grab the unbelievably tiny screw and then try to get this screwed down. Okay, I think I got this one in. Let's see what it looks like on the other side. Yeah, I actually did. And if you take a close look, you can actually see the polished ends of that little tiny screw sticking through on either side of that cap jewel. That's the part that they polished. I don't even know what you would use to hold the screw to polish the bottom of it like that. I have no idea. Okay, now I can simply pry back on this regulation arm. And as you can see, once it goes around that cap jewel, it'll allow me to regulate the watch once I get it fully reassembled. Now, I can just simply do the reverse of what I did before to take off this balance wheel. I can do the same thing to put it back on. So with that done, we are getting pretty darn close to having a completed watch here because, as I mentioned, I'm not going to be doing, any like big restoration of the case. It looked beautiful. It didn't even look like it was worn very much. And in fact, The other major thing I need to do here is the bottom jewel setting, and it looks like it won't come out even with Rodico. That's very strange. Oh, I know why. It's because it's dried on. Yeah, this thing really was desperate for a service, and yep, I can see that there's some built-on oil on that as well. So this is the same idea as the one that I did on the top, but thankfully it's just simpler because since it doesn't have shock protection system, it's just a jewel that holds it down on the bottom, and it's not, attached to the bridge where I need to take apart everything. And I can just do the same process here as well. So I'm going to put a little tiny bit of oil right in the center of that cap jewel, and then I can simply replace it on the bottom here and then screw it back down into place. Just like that. And, with that, this movement should be running quite well, I'm hoping. We'll see what kind of time it keeps. I mean, this is quite an old movement. It's got older technology in it, but overall, it's in darn good shape. This was, well, again, it did need a service, but it wasn't abused or anything. Okay, so once more, I need to put on the balance that we had taken off to do the cleaning and lubrication and everything. And, ooh, look at that. Oh, well, maybe I spoke too soon, but it kicked back up pretty nicely, it looked like. Yeah, it's looking really good, running strong. This is interesting. You notice when I put the screw in that the balance bridge moves around and then the whole thing stops. And this is a good reminder to use a stick like this, a piece of pegwood, something, a screwdriver, even if you have to. I mean, it's not really recommended because it can scratch stuff up, to secure those things in place. Okay, after some regulation, let's see how it does on the time grapher. I kind of ignore the rate until it stabilizes a little bit. Yeah, that's much, much better. Look at that, -1 second. -3 seconds a day, 265 degrees of amplitude is good. There's another example there. The beat error was actually out a little more than I would prefer, but this is another one of those kind of executive decision type deals where if this was an everyday watch, I would go in and take the time and the risk needed to repair it. But for a watch like this, I won't. And I do that on pocket watches sometimes too. I mean, if they're completely out, then I'll go in and do it because it actually makes it so that the watch doesn't run as well. But if they're even remotely in the ballpark, I'm usually pretty happy. Okay, I can put this dial back on. It's got dial screws on the side that hold it into place. Interesting dial here. It's kind of a flat dial, and I'm going to just use just a little cleaning swab here just in case there's any dirt. I know it can look like it's just straight up dirty and needs to be cleaned, but most dials aren't like that. And this one isn't either. They have multiple layers of lacquers or paints, inks applied to them. And usually when you see what looks like dirt, it's actually the surface level of that having been corrupted a little bit. Rather than just dirt sitting on the surface. And the harder you scrub, the more you rip up that surface area that got some sort of damage on it, and then you start to actually damage the dial itself. And this is a lesson that we all have to learn. Apparently, I had to do it myself too, where I kind of messed up a couple of dials before I realized, okay, I get how this works now. I should not be doing anything other than very light cleaning on it. Okay, after the hands have been installed, we can put the movement back into its white gold 14 karat case. Again, I was kind of surprised about that. And we can take a look at how the case looks. Oh, it looks really good out of the ultrasonic. Also, those diamonds on the top and bottom, they cleaned up lovely. It's pretty common for the settings that those type of diamonds are in to get a little bit of, dust and debris in there. And that actually affects the brilliance of how the diamonds appear to your eye. And after they're clean, they look beautiful. Just a quick check to make sure that the hands set properly. They're so small, those hands. They're blued. Again, another little attention to detail. I mentioned about this kind of rope strap that this particular watch has. I had taken off the actual buckle portion, and so I'll need to replace that so the watch is wearable. But I'm not going to be replacing the strap. I mean, this is, again, a totally different type of thing from what I have. I don't have anything that could replace this offhand. I'd probably have to make something if I wanted, which is, I assume, by the way, what this is, as it doesn't look like it's original to the watch necessarily. Is, I don't know, that the rope thing looks a little too modern to my eye. Not modern, but not 1930s or 40s. And let's take a look at the final product. A stunning little Hamilton watch. It's also a family heirloom for somebody that I care about. Really, really fun to work on such a tiny but impressive little watch. And yeah, this is what it's all about. Getting these little pieces of history back on the wrists of the people who love them. Thank you so much for hanging out with me and going on yet another watch restoration journey with me. I really do appreciate you taking the time. If you want to find me on Instagram, I am wristwatch_revival, and I'd love to say hi to you over there. Other than that, just wanted to say thanks again, and we'll see you next time.